I had been hunting since I was a kid, but this trip was different. It was October of 2012, and I had driven out alone to a stretch of forestland near the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 26 at the time, and I thought of myself as careful, experienced, and capable in the woods. I had hunted elk before, but that year I wanted to push myself deeper into the backcountry, away from roads and away from other people. I figured it would give me better chances of finding game and some real quiet. I left my truck at a small pull-off where a narrow dirt road ended. From there, I hiked in about 5 miles with my pack, rifle, tent, and enough supplies to last a week if I rationed carefully. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of pine, and the leaves on the ground crunched under my boots with every step. It was the kind of silence that felt thick, broken only by the distant sound of a creek. I remember thinking how empty it all felt, but in a way I liked. That emptiness was part of why I loved it. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot not far from a stream where I set up my tent. The clearing was small, hemmed in by tall spruce, but it felt hidden. I got a fire going, boiled some water for instant coffee, and sat there with my rifle leaning against a log. I thought about how far I was from anyone. No cell service, no noise, just woods and mountain ridges all around. That first night passed quietly. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind moving through the trees and the faint gurgle of the stream. Every once in a while, I heard small noises, twigs snapping, leaves shifting, but I told myself it was just deer or squirrels. I slept well enough. The next morning, I woke up early, before the sun even broke. My breath fogged in the cold air as I laced up my boots and started out with my rifle. I followed game trails uphill, through brush and over damp ground, scanning for sign. About 2 hours in, I found fresh elk tracks. They looked large, pressed deep into the dirt, still crisp at the edges. My excitement picked up. I followed them slowly, careful not to snap branches or make much sound. The tracks led me further uphill into thicker cover. I moved slow, stopping often to listen. At one point, I heard a heavy thud in the distance, like something big moving off. I crouched, straining to hear more, but after a few minutes, it was silent again. I never caught sight of the animal. When the sun got high, I decided to circle back to camp. The hike down took longer than I expected, and I realized how quickly this terrain could turn on you if you weren't paying attention. Every ridge looked like the next, and without my GPS and compass, it would have been easy to lose direction. By the time I reached camp, the shadows were already stretching long. I cooked some jerky and noodles over the fire and sat there thinking about the sound I'd heard earlier. It was heavy, not like a deer bounding. Elk maybe, or maybe even a bear. That thought sat in the back of my mind longer than I wanted it to. That night, I lay in the tent with the fire burned low outside. At some point, I woke up. It was dead quiet, no wind, no stream sound even though it was only 50 yards away. I didn't know what time it was. Then I heard it, a single, steady crack of a branch. Not the kind of quick snap from a squirrel, but a slow weight pressing down until it broke. I froze in my bag, heart thudding so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. For a while, it went silent again. Then another step, closer this time. My hand was already gripping my rifle, but I didn't move. I listened, every muscle locked. Whatever it was big, and it was moving slowly, almost deliberately, not bounding off like spooked game. It circled, not rushing, just steady steps through the brush, crunching leaves, then pausing. It went on like that for maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then nothing, just silence again. I lay awake until dawn, barely moving, my eyes fixed on the thin fabric of the tent as if I could see through it. When light finally crept in, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were fresh prints in the dirt, large, wide, not elk, bear. They had come within 15 feet of my tent, circled, then headed off toward the trees. My stomach dropped when I realized how close it had been. I spent the day jumpy. I still hunted a bit, but I couldn't focus. Every sound in the woods made me stop and turn. I carried my rifle tighter than usual, scanning more than I should have. By evening, I decided to move my camp further down toward the creek. Maybe it wouldn't matter, but something about being in a new spot felt better. I set up again, smaller fire this time, and forced myself to eat. But when darkness came, my nerves shot back. I tried reading a paperback I had packed, but I couldn't keep my focus. Every crack outside had me looking up. I kept thinking about how nobody would hear me yell out here, how I was just another piece of meat in these woods. That night, it returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. Heavy steps, slow and careful, circling the camp again. At one point, I heard breathing. Not the kind of faint huff from a deer, but deep, steady exhales, closer than I wanted to believe. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, rifle aimed toward the tent door, finger against the trigger guard. My hands shook so bad I worried the noise alone would give me away. The steps lingered, pacing, sometimes stopping completely. I imagined it standing there, watching the tent, trying to figure me out. I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. Then, as before, it left. The sounds faded into the trees, swallowed by distance, but the fear stayed. I didn't sleep at all. By dawn, I made my choice. I wasn't staying. The idea of hunting was gone from me. I just wanted out. I packed fast, shoving gear into my bag, dousing the fire, checking and rechecking that nothing was left behind. The trail back to the truck felt twice as long. I kept glancing behind me, every shadow twisting into the shape of something following. When I finally saw the truck through the trees, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in 2 days. I threw my pack in the back, climbed inside, and sat there gripping the wheel. My hands still shook. The woods looked so calm from where I sat, quiet and beautiful. But all I could think about was the sound of breathing outside my tent, the slow circle of heavy steps in the dark. I drove out of there and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I've hunted since then, but never that deep alone. People like to talk about the danger of weather, of getting lost, of accidents with a rifle. They don't talk much about the way the woods change when you know something bigger than you has decided to come close. Not curious like deer, not careless like small game, but with a kind of intention. That trip taught me something simple and clear. Out there, you're not the top of anything. You're just another body in the woods. And sometimes something else notices. I still remember the summer of 2011 when my boss, Richard, suggested we take a short camping trip out to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. At the time, I was 28 and had only been working under him for about a year. He was in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who always seemed in control. We didn't really have a close relationship, but he said he wanted to get away for a weekend and thought it would be a good chance for me to unplug from work. I didn't want to say no. When your boss asks you to camp with him, you say yes, even if you're not really sure it's your thing. We left Detroit on a Friday morning in his truck, loaded with gear, 2 tents, a cooler full of food, fishing rods, and enough firewood to last a few nights. The drive was long, about 8 hours, and the closer we got to the wilderness, the thinner the cell reception became. By the time we pulled onto the dirt road leading to a secluded state forest campground, my phone showed no service at all. I tried not to think too much about it. The campsite was tucked deep in the woods, about a mile off a gravel road that itself felt forgotten. Pine trees rose up on every side, tall and heavy, with their branches blocking most of the sunlight. The air smelled damp and earthy, and even though it was late July, it felt cooler under that thick canopy. We set up camp near a small creek, where the sound of water running over rocks carried in the background. Richard pitched his tent about 10 feet from mine, and we built a fire pit between them. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you pay attention to every snap of a branch or rustle in the leaves. That first night, everything went fine. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, drank a few beers, and sat in folding chairs until the flames died down. The woods around us stayed still. Occasionally, I thought I saw shadows move just beyond the firelight, but I knew it was just my eyes playing tricks. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, the forest was alive with small sounds. The creek, insects, a few owls. It was almost peaceful. Almost. The next morning, Richard wanted to fish, so we hiked a trail that led down to a larger river about a mile from camp. We spent hours there, standing on rocks, casting lines, pulling in a few trout. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but Richard seemed completely in his element. By the time we got back, the sun was low. We built another fire, cooked the fish, and settled in. That's when things started to feel off. I noticed it first. Around dusk, I caught sight of movement in the trees behind Richard's tent. Just a flicker, like someone stepping quickly out of view. I froze, staring hard, but nothing else moved. I told myself it was probably a deer. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we weren't alone. Later, as we sat by the fire, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Richard seemed relaxed, talking about work and his old camping trips, but I found myself answering less and less, distracted by that nagging sense of being watched. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. The woods felt different. The natural noises seemed too sparse, like things had gone quiet. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps outside my tent. Slow, steady, crunching on the pine needles. At first, I thought it was Richard getting up to use the woods, but the steps didn't sound like someone walking casually. They sounded hesitant, almost like someone circling. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The steps moved around, then stopped. For several minutes, there was only silence. Then I heard them again, retreating, fading into the distance. By the time daylight came, I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it or not. But when I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something strange. In the dirt near the fire pit were fresh boot prints. They weren't mine and they weren't Richard's. His boots were bigger and had a distinct tread. These were smaller, narrower, maybe from hiking boots. I stared at them for a long time before Richard came out of his tent. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, pretending everything was normal. But inside, I felt unsettled. The day passed quietly enough. We cooked breakfast, hiked some trails, and even swam in the river. But I couldn't relax. Every time I looked into the trees, I expected to see someone standing there. I noticed that Richard, too, had become quieter. He wasn't cracking jokes or telling stories the way he had before. He kept glancing into the woods the same way I did. I think he felt it too, though neither of us wanted to admit it. That evening, as the fire burned low, we both sat in silence longer than usual. It was like we were waiting for something. I don't know how long we stayed there, but eventually, I heard it again, movement in the trees. This time, Richard heard it too. He tensed up, staring past the fire into the shadows. Neither of us spoke. The noise came closer, slow, deliberate. Then it stopped. The woods went dead silent. Not a bird, not a bug, nothing. Just stillness. Richard stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through branches, lit up patches of ground, but nothing was there. Still, I knew. Somebody was out there. We weren't alone. We didn't stay by the fire much longer. Richard doused it with water, and we both went into our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening. At some point, I heard it again, the same slow footsteps. This time, they came right up to the edge of my tent. I could hear the crunch of pine needles inches from my head. My body locked up. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. I swear I could hear them breathing. Then, just like before, the steps moved away. I heard them near Richard's tent, then fading into the forest. At first light, Richard told me we were packing up. He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. We tore down camp faster than I thought possible, stuffing gear into bags, barely eating breakfast. When we finally got everything into the truck and pulled onto the dirt road, I felt like I could breathe again. Neither of us said much on the long drive back, but we both knew someone had been out there with us, watching, waiting, maybe just passing through, maybe not. But whoever it was, they had been close, too close. I never went camping with Richard again after that. In fact, I didn't camp at all for years. The idea of being alone in the woods with no phone signal, no one around for miles, filled me with a kind of dread I couldn't shake. Even now, more than a decade later, I sometimes wake up at night and remember those footsteps outside my tent, the sound of someone circling, the silence of the forest pressing in. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. And that, to me, was far more terrifying. I was 27 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the backwoods of northern Idaho. It was early September of 2014, the air still holding on to a bit of summer warmth during the day but dropping sharp and cold as soon as the sun went down. I had been working long weeks in construction and wanted a break from the noise of the city, the constant grind of traffic, and the smell of asphalt. Being alone in the woods always felt like a reset button for me, and I figured a few nights out there with nothing but my tent, rifle, and gear would be the perfect way to clear my head. The drive itself took nearly 4 hours. By the time I turned off the highway onto the dirt logging road, my phone had already lost service. I bounced along that road for another hour, winding through dense pine forests and old cuts where loggers had cleared decades ago. I didn't see another vehicle the entire way in. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, empty, isolated. I finally parked my truck on the edge of a small clearing near a creek. The area wasn't an official campsite, just a flat enough spot to pitch a tent. I unloaded slowly, taking my time to set everything up just right. My tent under a stand of tall pines, my fire ring built out of stones I gathered from the creek bed, my rifle leaned against the side of the truck. I liked being methodical, making sure every item was in place before the sun dipped. Out here, being sloppy could mean waking up soaked in rain or scrambling for gear in the dark. The first day went fine. I spent most of it walking along the creek, scouting for signs of elk or deer. I saw tracks in the mud, droppings, and even a scrape on a tree where a buck had rubbed his antlers. By evening, I cooked a simple meal of beans and venison over the fire, drank coffee from my metal mug, and sat listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets chirped, the creek bubbled, and every once in a while I'd hear the distant flap of wings as some bird cut through the air above the trees. The night fell hard and cold. I layered up inside my sleeping bag, feeling the damp chill of the earth beneath me. I dozed off to the faint crackle of dying embers. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the cold, but then I realized it was noise. A faint crunching, steady and deliberate, somewhere beyond the thin nylon walls of my tent. It wasn't the random snap of a branch falling or the wind shifting the brush. It had rhythm, the uneven but purposeful weight of footsteps. I lay frozen, my breathing slow and shallow. My rifle was only a few feet away, but reaching for it meant unzipping the tent. I didn't move. The steps came closer, then paused. I could hear the creek still running, but over it there was another sound, the low scrape of something brushing against bark. Could have been an elk, I told myself, or a bear. The forest was full of both. But the more I listened, the less it sounded like an animal. Animals shuffle, snap twigs, move quick or hesitant. This was different. The pauses were too long. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be stopping to listen, maybe even trying to be quiet. I stayed awake for what felt like hours. Eventually, the steps faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. When the sun finally pushed light through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the pale morning air. My breath hung in front of me. I scanned the clearing carefully. The ground around the edge of the creek showed new boot prints. Human, not mine. They circled the area, cutting close to my tent, before disappearing back into the timber. The realization hit hard. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night, stood only feet from where I was sleeping, and then walked away. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was another hunter. Maybe he stumbled onto my camp by accident. But no hunter in his right mind wanders that close to someone else's tent in the dead of night without saying a word. That thought gnawed at me. I kept busy that day, forcing myself to focus on fishing the creek and gathering more firewood. But every few minutes, I caught myself glancing into the tree-line, listening for sounds. The woods that had felt so calm yesterday now felt heavy, like they were pressing in on me. That night, I built my fire bigger, trying to push back the darkness. I sat close to it, my rifle across my lap, and listened. Hours passed. Just when I thought maybe nothing would happen, I heard it again, the crunch of boots in the dirt, somewhere out beyond the glow of my fire. Slow, careful. My heart thumped so hard I felt it in my throat. I kept my eyes locked on the dark, but nothing moved. Then a shape flickered between the trees, too tall to be an animal, too steady to be a shadow. I gripped the rifle tighter, thumb resting on the safety. The steps came closer again, stopping just outside the firelight. Whoever it was, they stayed hidden, just far enough that I couldn't see a face. The fire popped loudly, and the sound seemed to break the moment. The steps retreated into the woods again. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed up my gear fast. I wasn't about to spend another night there. I loaded everything into the truck, my eyes scanning the trees the entire time. When I walked down to the creek to fill my canteen, I froze. There, pressed into the soft mud, were more boot prints. Fresh. They weren't just passing by this time. They faced the direction of my tent, standing still for long minutes before turning back. It was clear then. Someone had been watching me, not by accident, not just passing through. They had stood there, in the dark, watching me while I slept. I drove out fast, bouncing hard along the rutted dirt road until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I was nearly an hour away and finally had cell service again. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that whoever had been out there might still be somewhere behind me on that long, empty stretch of highway. I never went back to that area again. I've camped since then, but not alone, and never that deep in the woods. When people ask me why, I just say the place gave me a bad feeling. I don't tell them about the footsteps, the prints, or the figure that lingered just beyond the firelight. What I know is this: the wilderness is vast, and out there you expect to see animals, storms, maybe even get lost. But you don't expect to wake up and realize another person has been circling your camp in the dead of night, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching. And that silence, the fact they never spoke, never revealed themselves, that's what made it terrifying. Because it meant they had no good reason to be there at all. I went camping in the summer of 1998, deep in the mountains of northern Colorado. I was 26 then, still full of energy, still thinking I could handle just about anything the outdoors threw at me. I had been camping and hunting since I was a teenager, and that summer I wanted to push myself a little further than usual. I decided I would camp alone for a few nights, away from the usual campgrounds and without any real plan other than to hike as far as I could during the day and set up camp when the sun started dropping. It was late July, and the air was hot in the day but dropped to near freezing once the sun slipped behind the peaks. I carried only what I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some freeze-dried food, and my rifle, which I always carried in the backcountry. I started out early one morning, the trail winding through pine and spruce forests, the air thick with the smell of sap and the sound of insects buzzing in the heat. After about 6 hours of hiking, I left the marked trail, wanting to get further into the woods where there wouldn't be anyone else around. By late afternoon, I found a decent clearing on the side of a hill. There was a small stream running down below, maybe 100 yards away, and plenty of wood for a fire. I set up camp and cooked one of the meals I'd packed. The sun fell fast behind the ridge, and soon it was dark, the kind of heavy dark that only exists in the deep woods, where even the stars can't always break through the thick canopy. I fed the fire, sat on a log, and listened to the quiet. It wasn't silent, never is in the forest, but the sounds were distant. Crickets, a few owls, maybe a branch breaking in the distance. I had camped enough to know those noises meant nothing. That first night passed without trouble. I slept hard and woke just after sunrise, my breath visible in the cold morning air. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and started moving again, breaking down camp and packing everything up. I hiked most of the day, climbing higher into the backcountry. The terrain got steeper and rougher, the trees thinning out as I got higher. I didn't see another person the entire time. By the second night, I found a spot not far from a ridge line. It wasn't as comfortable as the first campsite, but I was tired enough not to care. The ground was rocky, the soil thin, but there was just enough flat space to pitch my tent. I was about 10 miles from the nearest marked trail now, maybe more, and the sense of being completely alone was heavy. That night was different. I was dozing in my tent when I heard something heavy moving outside. At first I thought it was an elk or maybe even a black bear, but the steps were slower, uneven. They came in bursts, then stopped. My heart pounded as I reached for my rifle, keeping still and listening. The footsteps circled around the area where my tent was pitched. The sound of brush snapping under weight, breathing. At least I swore I could hear breathing, low and unsteady. I froze, waiting. The steps eventually moved off into the dark, fading into the trees. I lay awake the rest of the night, gripping my rifle, barely moving. When the sun rose, I stepped outside the tent and scanned the area. The ground was littered with broken branches, but what made my stomach drop were the footprints in the soil near the edge of camp. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, human boots. Someone had been walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I tried to convince myself maybe it was just another hiker who had wandered close without realizing I was there. But the tracks weren't the clean edges of a person passing by. They circled, stopped, doubled back. Whoever it was had lingered. I packed up camp quickly, too fast, fumbling as I shoved things into my bag. I hiked fast that morning, heading downhill toward lower ground, toward the direction I thought the main trail would be. My sense of direction had always been good, but in the thick forest, everything started to look the same. Hours passed, and I still didn't find the trail. I stopped to rest near a fallen tree, and that's when I saw something that made my skin crawl. A small piece of fabric, torn and hanging on a branch. It was part of a blue flannel shirt, and it looked fresh, like it had been ripped recently. I didn't own a shirt like that. I kept moving, my nerves on edge, glancing behind me every few minutes. The forest felt tighter, the air heavier, and every sound seemed louder than usual. By the time evening came, I had no choice but to set up camp again. My legs were shaking from exhaustion, and I couldn't risk stumbling around in the dark. I found a hollow near a cluster of boulders, pitched my tent as quietly as I could, and skipped making a fire. I ate a cold meal out of a bag and sat inside the tent with my rifle across my lap. The night dragged on forever, I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Slow, deliberate, sticks snapping, rocks shifting. This time, the sound came closer, inching toward the boulders where I had set up camp. My throat went dry. I kept the safety off the rifle, finger hovering near the trigger. Whoever was out there didn't say a word, didn't make any noise other than those slow steps. At one point, I thought I saw the shadow of a figure through the thin nylon of the tent wall. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. I held my breath until my chest ached. Then, just like before, the steps faded away, disappearing into the night. When the sky finally lightened, I broke camp and started moving again. I didn't care if I was going in circles, I just wanted to get out. Around mid-morning, I found the trail. Relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. I followed it, faster than I should have, stumbling down the switchbacks until I reached the parking lot where I had left my truck. There were only 2 other vehicles parked there when I arrived, both covered in dust like they'd been there for weeks. My truck was untouched. I tossed my pack in the back and got in. When I turned the key, the sound of the engine felt like safety. On the drive back down the mountain road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just the empty dirt road winding behind me. When I finally got home that night, I unpacked everything and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it had been another hiker. Maybe someone just happened to be passing through and saw my camp. But the way the tracks circled my tent, the ripped fabric, the shadow outside my shelter, those weren't accidents. Someone was out there watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I never went back to that part of the mountains again, and I never camped alone after that summer. I was 26 years old when I decided to travel across Europe on my own. It was the summer of 2014, and I wanted to see more than just the big cities and tourist spots. I had already been in Paris for a week, but the noise, the traffic, and the crowds were wearing me down. I wanted some quiet. I bought a cheap tent, a sleeping bag, and a small stove in a camping shop before catching a train south into the countryside. My plan was simple. Get off at a small town in the middle of nowhere, walk until I found a decent spot, and camp for a few nights. I thought it would be peaceful, maybe even healing. I got off at a little town called Saint-Jean-du-Gard. It was a warm afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of pine and grass. The mountains were low but sharp against the horizon, and the streets were nearly empty. I filled my backpack with water and some bread, cheese, and fruit from a small shop, then started walking along a narrow road that led out into the hills. After about 2 hours, I cut off into the woods, following what looked like an old path, barely wide enough for a car. The ground crunched under my boots, and the air grew cooler the deeper I went. By the time the sun started dropping, I found a small clearing near a slope. A few stones formed a rough circle that looked like people had once made fires there. The grass was short, the trees thick enough to block most of the wind. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry branches, and made a small fire to boil water for noodles. When the light drained from the sky, the forest turned almost black, the smell of pine stronger, the air colder. I told myself this was what I had come for. Quiet, away from everyone. That night, lying in my tent, I struggled to fall asleep. The forest never really went silent. I heard crickets, branches cracking somewhere in the distance, an owl's sharp cry. The ground was hard, and every shift made the fabric of the tent crinkle loudly. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard footsteps. They weren't animal sounds. It was heavy, slow, like someone walking on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. The sound stopped, and after a long while, I convinced myself it was just my head playing tricks. The next morning, I woke stiff and tired. The sun was bright, the The fire had gone cold, and everything felt safer in daylight. I made coffee and ate bread with cheese, then decided to hike deeper into the hills. I carried a small bag with water and left the rest of my things inside the tent. The woods were beautiful, but after a couple of hours, I realized I had gone farther than I planned. On my way back, I cut across a slope and found an old, rusted car hidden under vines. Its windows were smashed, its doors missing, and the metal frame had been sitting there for years. It gave me an uneasy feeling, like it didn't belong there anymore. When I reached my camp again, I froze. The flap of my tent was open. I was sure I had zipped it closed before leaving. My backpack was moved, lying on its side in the grass, but nothing seemed missing. My food, my stove, my sleeping bag, all still there. The only thing that felt off was how neatly everything had been touched, like someone had gone through it carefully. I looked around, searching the trees, but saw nothing. That evening, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the tent as the sky grew darker, listening. My stomach was tight, and every sound outside felt sharper than before. When night came, I lay down fully dressed, my boots near the sleeping bag, in case I needed to move quickly. The hours dragged. At some point, I heard it again, the slow crunch of footsteps. This time it was closer, just beyond the trees. They circled the clearing, stopping every few seconds, then starting again. I felt sweat on my face even though the night was cool. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would give me away. The steps came nearer until they were right outside the tent. I could see the faint shape of a shadow moving against the thin fabric as something blocked the moonlight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a long moment, the shadow shifted, and I heard the sound of someone walking away, slow and deliberate. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour before I dared to move again. The first light, I packed everything quickly. My hands shook as I shoved the sleeping bag into the pack. I walked back toward the road without eating, without resting, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods felt different now, less peaceful, more like a maze. When I finally reached the small road leading back toward the town, I felt a rush of relief. But the relief didn't last. As I walked, I noticed footprints in the dirt along the edge of the road. They were fresh, the tread deep. They matched the sound I had heard. Heavy boots, bigger than my own. I couldn't tell if they were ahead of me or behind me, but I knew they weren't mine. I pushed myself faster, following the road downhill until the town came into view. The streets were just as quiet as before, the air hot and still. When I finally reached the station, I sat on the bench, drenched in sweat, waiting for the next train out. I didn't care where it went. Even now, years later, I think about that night. Whoever it was didn't hurt me. They didn't steal anything. But they went through my things, they stood outside my tent, and they let me know they were there. That was enough. Since then, I've never camped alone again. I was 24 when it happened, back in the summer of 2013. I had just finished college and wanted some time away from everything before starting a new job. I'd grown up in Arizona and spent a lot of time outdoors, but I had never really camped alone. Most trips were with friends or family. That summer, I decided to do it differently. I thought a solo trip into the northern part of New Mexico, up near the edge of Carson National Forest, would clear my head. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, food, small cooler, flashlight, hunting knife, and a rifle my uncle had given me when I was younger. I didn't plan on hunting, but it gave me comfort to bring it. The drive out was long, but once I left the paved road and followed a narrow dirt track through the pines, it felt like I had entered another world. The air smelled like resin and dust. The sun was sharp in the sky, but the trees gave enough shade to keep the ground cool. I picked a spot near a dry creek bed, about a mile from where the dirt track ended. The place looked untouched. No trash, no fire rings, no signs of people. Just scattered pine needles and fallen logs. I pitched the tent, collected wood, and set up camp. By the time the sun started lowering, I already felt a strange mix of peace and unease. It's hard to explain. Being alone in the woods is different than hiking with others. Every sound feels sharper. A branch snaps and your head turns before you realize it. You notice how quiet the forest really is once the wind dies down. That first night, I cooked some beans over the fire, ate in silence, then sat back and listened to the night. Crickets, a few distant owl calls, the occasional rustle from some small animal. Normal sounds, but every so often I thought I heard something heavier, like a step, then nothing. I told myself it was deer. This was their land after all. When I finally crawled into my tent, the silence pressed in harder. I lay awake for hours, my ears straining. At one point, I swore I heard a low, steady breathing outside the tent. Not close, but not far either. I gripped the knife under my sleeping bag and waited. The sound faded, or maybe I just fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, the air felt normal again, like the unease of the night had been just in my head. I brewed some coffee over the fire and went for a walk down the dry creek. The sand there was soft, almost like dust, and I saw tracks. Hoof prints, probably deer. But mixed in with them were prints that looked almost like human barefoot tracks, only longer, narrower, and sunk deeper. I crouched over them for a while, trying to make sense of it. I told myself maybe someone had passed through barefoot, though it didn't really make sense. Who hikes barefoot through miles of rough ground? Still, I didn't dwell on it. I kept walking, turned back after a mile, and went about my day, fishing in a small pond I found, collecting firewood, writing in a notebook I'd brought. That night was worse. I built the fire higher, but it didn't ease the feeling that something was watching me. As the flames crackled, I heard something move just outside the glow of the firelight. A slow, steady shuffle of steps. Not running, not crashing through brush like an animal might. More like deliberate walking, pausing, then walking again. I sat frozen, rifle across my lap, eyes straining into the dark. Every time I turned my head, I thought I saw the faint outline of something standing still between the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the firelight. The longer I stared, the less certain I was. Around midnight, I gave up and went inside the tent. I left the rifle next to me, safety off. The fabric of the tent suddenly felt paper thin, like nothing between me and whatever was out there. My heart pounded in my chest so loud I thought it would give me away. At some point, I heard footsteps circling the tent. Slow, dragging footsteps crunching pine needles. I held my breath. The steps stopped right by the entrance. I could see the faint shadow of legs through the thin nylon wall. They weren't shaped right. They bent wrong, almost backwards. I don't know how long I stayed like that, gripping the rifle, every muscle screaming to either shoot or run. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there. Eventually, the fire outside burned down to embers, and with the fading light, the shadow disappeared. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I crawled out, stiff and shaking. Around the tent were prints again. They weren't deer and they weren't human either. Long, narrow, deep impressions that dug into the soil in uneven strides, as if whatever made them was limping or dragging. That was enough for me. I packed up as fast as I could, throwing gear into the truck without care. I didn't eat, didn't even put out the fire properly. My hands shook the whole time. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced into the mirror. For a second, I swore I saw something standing in the trees at the edge of the road. Tall, thin, two long arms hanging at its sides, its head cocked at an angle too sharp to be right. By the time I reached pavement, I was drenched in sweat. I didn't stop until I was back in town, where people moved around in daylight, cars passed, and the world felt normal again. I didn't tell anyone the full story when I got home, just said I'd cut the trip short. Friends laughed, said I couldn't handle being alone out there. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw. And I know I'll never camp alone again, not out there. Years later, I still think about those tracks, those steps circling the tent, and the way the shadow stood just outside. I've read enough since then to know what some people call it, a skinwalker, but I don't need a name for it. What I know is this: something was out there, something that moved like it wanted me to know it was close, but never quite showed itself. The scariest part isn't what I saw, it's knowing it let me leave. I was 29 when I decided to take a short camping trip out in northern Minnesota. It was late September of 2016, and I had a few days off work that I didn't want to waste sitting around my apartment in Duluth. I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler with some food, and a simple hunting knife. I drove out to a forested area near the Canadian border, not too far from the town of Ely, where the roads start to turn into dirt paths and the trees seem endless. The air was crisp that time of year. The leaves were already turning shades of orange and red, and the evenings cooled off fast. I parked my car near a clearing that wasn't an official campsite but seemed flat enough to set up. I figured I'd only be out there one night, maybe two, so I wasn't worried about finding a perfect spot. There was a small river a short walk downhill from where I pitched the tent, and that gave me some comfort knowing I'd have water nearby. The first couple of hours went smoothly. I built a small fire pit using rocks I gathered around, laid out my gear neatly, and sat back watching the sun go down. The silence out there was thick. No traffic, no voices, just the sound of trees shifting in the breeze and the occasional bird. As night came on, I ate some food I'd brought and sat near the fire until the wood burned down to glowing embers. I crawled into my tent around 10. The cold crept in faster than I expected, so I bundled myself tight in the sleeping bag. I woke up maybe 3 hours later. My phone said it was around 1:15 a.m. I hadn't set an alarm. Something had pulled me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was the cold again, but then I realized I had heard something. It wasn't close, but it was distinct enough in the stillness of the forest. It sounded like movement through the underbrush, not the light shuffle of a rabbit or a squirrel. Something heavier, something deliberate. I lay there, holding my breath, straining my ears. It would come in short bursts, then stop. Leaves crunching, branches snapping softly, a slow kind of pacing. The sound moved one way, then another, like whoever or whatever was out there didn't have a set direction. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a black bear, since they weren't uncommon in that part of the state. But something about the pattern made me uneasy. Animals usually move with a certain rhythm, fast when startled or steady when grazing. This felt different, like it was aware of where it was stepping. I shifted quietly in the sleeping bag, trying not to make noise. My hunting knife was near my boots at the entrance of the tent, and I slowly reached for it, keeping my movements small. My heart was already pounding hard enough that I was sure if anyone was outside, they'd hear it. The footsteps circled farther out and then got quiet. I lay there for what felt like an hour, barely blinking, waiting for the noise to come back. Eventually, fatigue caught up, and I drifted in and out of light sleep. At dawn, the light filtered weakly through the tent, and I finally sat up. When I stepped outside, I looked around carefully. The forest looked calm, just like before, but I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I walked around the edge of the clearing, scanning the dirt and leaves. That's when I noticed prints near the tree line. They weren't deep enough to be from a large animal, but they weren't small either. At first glance, they looked like boot prints, the kind you'd expect from a person walking through the woods. The size seemed average, maybe a men's 10 or 11. I followed them a short way until they blended with the leaves and vanished. My mind raced. I hadn't seen another car anywhere along the dirt road in. I hadn't noticed any other campers. The idea of someone else being out there, watching silently in the night, didn't sit right. I thought about packing up right then, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to cut the trip short. It was broad daylight now, and the forest seemed less threatening. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, that the prints were old, or maybe left by hunters earlier in the week. I spent the day walking along the river, fishing a little and trying to relax. I cooked a simple lunch and then read from a book I'd brought. By the time evening came again, I was almost back in a comfortable rhythm. The fear from the night before felt like it belonged to another world. But when the sun dipped, that tightness in my chest returned. I made my fire bigger this time, gathering extra wood and feeding the flames steadily. The thought of light keeping things away, even if irrational, was enough to calm me a little. I forced myself into the tent around midnight, knife tucked close this time. I listened harder than before, my ears practically begging for silence. First, nothing came, just the occasional distant cry of an owl. But closer to 2 in the morning, the crunching started again. This time, it was nearer, circling in tighter arcs. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't clumsy. Whoever it was, they were moving with intent. The sound stopped directly behind my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare unzip the flap or make a move. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt. Then I heard the faint sound of fabric shifting, like fingers brushing against the outside of my tent wall. Just a single drag across the nylon. Slow, deliberate. My whole body went cold. I gripped the knife so hard my hand shook. I stayed frozen, waiting for the next touch, the next step, anything. But nothing else came. After a few minutes, the sounds retreated, soft steps fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I shoved everything back into my pack without bothering to fold or organize. My hands were shaking as I pulled the tent stakes out of the ground. The embers from the fire were still faintly glowing when I left them behind. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless, every shadow between the trees looking sharper than it should. When I finally hit pavement and saw another vehicle pass me, I realized I'd been holding my breath for miles. I've gone camping many times since then, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods without knowing who else might be nearby. I still don't know if it was a hunter, a drifter, or someone with worse intentions that night, but the thought that a stranger was silently circling my camp, close enough to touch the thin wall of my tent, is something that has never left my mind. I learned one thing for certain. It wasn't the dark or the wild animals that made me feel unsafe. It was knowing there are people out there who move quietly enough in the night to make you wish it was only a bear. I was 23 years old in the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a camping trip by myself in northern Arizona. I had done plenty of solo camping before, usually sticking to state parks and trails where I knew I would at least see another hiker or hear cars from a road nearby. This time I wanted something different. I had been stressed out from work and life in general, so I wanted to push myself further into the quiet, to find a place where I wouldn't hear anything man-made at all. I found a spot about 30 miles south of Kayenta, a stretch of desert and forest that didn't have official campgrounds. I read about it online. Some hunters had mentioned it in old forum posts, and it sounded exactly like what I was looking for. Empty, forgotten, and isolated. I left early on a Friday morning and drove for hours until the paved highway turned to gravel, and then eventually into a dirt path that my old Jeep barely handled. The land changed slowly as I went deeper. Red sand turned into rocky washes, scattered juniper trees became thicker, and eventually the land seemed to swallow the road. I pulled off into a flat clearing surrounded by brush and tall pinyon pines. The nearest house I had passed was at least 15 miles back. I felt excited, but also a little uneasy, like I was stepping into someone else's land uninvited. The air was hot and still, and the only sound was the wind pushing through the trees in short bursts, almost like it was blowing in circles. I set up my small tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered enough wood for a fire that night. By the time the sun started to drop behind the low mesas, the entire place looked even more remote than I had expected. Shadows stretched across the ground in strange shapes, and the silence got heavier. I remember cooking a simple dinner over the fire, beans and rice from a small pot, and watching the sky turn purple. That first night I felt calm for a while, but as it got darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being that far out without a single other person around. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the usual creaking of trees or the scratching of small animals in the brush. It was sharp, uneven, almost like footsteps, but spaced too far apart, like whoever or whatever it was took long strides. I laid still inside the tent, barely breathing, listening. The sound circled the camp slowly, pausing now and then continuing. My fire had burned down to embers, and the moonlight cast pale shadows across the ground. I wanted to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe even a coyote, but the steps sounded heavier. I waited until they faded into the distance before I let myself drift back into sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and immediately saw tracks in the dirt near where the fire had been. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't animal tracks either. The ground was too dry to hold a perfect shape, but the marks were strange, almost like bare human feet, only longer, wider, and uneven. I crouched down to study them, my stomach tightening. I told myself it had to be some kind of distorted animal print, maybe a mountain lion or even a cow that wandered this far out. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I tried to shake it off by going on a hike. I followed a dry wash east for a couple of miles, carrying only a water bottle and a pocket knife. The land felt endless. Sharp red cliffs cut into the horizon, and the silence pressed on my ears until I felt like I could hear my own blood pumping. At one point, I thought I saw movement on a ridge above me, just a quick flash of something pale against the dark rocks. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood there for a long time staring, then forced myself to keep walking. When I returned to camp that afternoon, something was wrong. My tent looked like it had been moved. It wasn't collapsed, but one of the stakes had been pulled up, and the flap was hanging open even though I had zipped it closed. Inside, my sleeping bag was dragged halfway out, and the small bag of food I had left sealed was open with some of it missing. Not scattered like an animal had ripped into it, but missing neatly, as if taken by a hand. That night, I didn't sleep much. I built the fire bigger and sat up next to it with my knife on my lap, my flashlight within reach. The woods and brush beyond the firelight seemed alive in a way I can't describe. Every crack of a branch made my chest tighten. Around midnight, I heard it again. The steps, slow, deliberate, circling just out of sight. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing between two trees, tall and thin, with shoulders too wide, its head slightly bent, like it was watching me. When I aimed the flashlight, nothing was there, but the sound didn't stop. It circled until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, then faded away. By the third day, I was unraveling. My hands shook when I tried to make coffee, and every time the wind moved the trees, I flinched. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me was stubborn. I had come all this way for peace and solitude, and I didn't want to feel chased out. I decided I'd stay one more night, then head back in the morning. That evening, I built the fire even larger than before, stacking logs so the flames would last as long as possible. I sat with my back against a tree so I could see everything around me. The sun dipped down, the land turned black, and the silence pressed in again. This time, when the steps came, they didn't circle. They came closer. I could hear them in the dirt, slow and heavy, then stopping, then starting again. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The fire cracked, sending sparks up into the dark, and for a second I caught sight of it. It was standing at the edge of the firelight, half hidden by the brush. Tall, thin, with arms too long. The skin looked pale, almost gray in the light, stretched tight like it didn't fit right. The face was wrong. It looked human, but not human at the same time, like it was wearing a person's skin that didn't belong to it. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. We just stayed like that, me frozen, it standing there in silence, until I finally grabbed my flashlight and shined it straight at it. The light hit, and in that instant, it moved. Not away, but low, dropping down on all fours in a way no human could, its limbs bending wrong. It crawled fast along the ground and then disappeared into the darkness beyond the trees. My stomach turned cold, and I knew I couldn't stay another second. I threw my things into the Jeep without packing properly. Sleeping bag, tent, food, everything in a pile. I didn't care what I left behind. The fire was still burning when I turned the engine and tore down that dirt road, headlights bouncing on every rock and dip. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, hours later, when the sun had finally come up. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see it running after me or waiting at the side of the road. But nothing was there. I never went back to that place. I never even told anyone the full story until now, because I knew how it would sound. People would say I was just tired, that my mind played tricks on me, that it was just an animal. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a mountain lion, and it wasn't a person. When I think about it now, the thing that scares me the most isn't that it was out there watching me. It's that it let me leave. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was late September of 2004, and the weather in northern Minnesota was cool but not yet brutal. I was 27 years old back then, working long shifts at a warehouse, and the one thing that kept me steady was the thought of getting away from noise, people, and deadlines. I decided to camp alone in the Chippewa National Forest, far from the busier campgrounds. I wanted isolation, just me and the woods. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. I parked my old Ford Ranger at a gravel pull-off and hiked about 2 miles into the forest with my pack, tent, and some basic supplies. The trail was narrow and overgrown, not an official camping site, but that was the point. I wanted to be away from everyone. The forest was thick with pines and birch trees, the ground soft with layers of needles and moss. I found a flat spot near a small stream where the trees opened just enough for some sunlight to filter through. It seemed perfect. By late afternoon, I had my tent up, a small fire pit built, and water filtered from the stream. I cooked a simple meal of beans and rice on my small propane stove, then settled down with a flask of whiskey. The air was sharp, carrying that mix of damp earth and pine that clings to your clothes. The quietness was heavy. No cars, no people, just the distant call of a loon somewhere across the water and the occasional snapping branch as something moved in the undergrowth. That first night, I lay in my tent listening to the forest. At first, I thought it was calming, but the longer I listened, the more I noticed the irregular sounds. A branch cracking here, leaves crunching there. I reminded myself that deer move through the woods all the time, and raccoons have no fear of tents. Still, lying in the dark with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever was outside made every sound sharper. I barely slept. The second day passed quietly. I spent time fishing at the stream, not catching much but enough to cook for lunch. I wandered deeper into the woods, taking note of landmarks so I wouldn't lose my way. I found an old rusted canteen half buried under leaves, maybe from 100 years ago. Something about holding that piece of metal made me feel strange, like I wasn't as alone out there as I thought. People had been here before. Maybe they still came here. That night, things shifted. I had just finished stoking the fire when I heard it. Not the usual snap of a twig or rustle of a squirrel. This was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. They came from the tree line opposite the stream. Slow, crunching steps on the dry leaves, then a pause, then another step. My skin tightened, and I held my breath, staring into the darkness. I told myself it was probably a deer, but deer don't walk like that. They move quick, skittish, uneven. This was slower, heavier, human-like. I stood by the fire for a long time, straining to see between the trees. The sound stopped. I felt stupid standing there, gripping the handle of my hatchet like some paranoid fool. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree branch fell. Maybe I imagined it. I doused the fire, climbed into the tent, and zipped myself in. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the idea that someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I barely slept again. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but I woke to a noise around 3 a.m. The sound of water splashing. The stream. Someone or something was moving through it. It wasn't a fish or a small animal. The splashes were too heavy. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric of the tent as if it could protect me. The splashing went on for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I waited for the footsteps, but nothing came. After a long silence, I finally drifted off again, though my dreams twisted with unease. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked to the stream. The ground near the bank was soft, muddy. That's when I saw them, prints. They weren't boots. They weren't shoes. They looked like bare feet, but larger than mine and pressed deep into the mud. 5 toes, heel clear as day. My stomach sank. Who the hell was walking barefoot through the woods in late September? I told myself maybe they were old prints, but the edges were still sharp, fresh. I spent the day restless, unable to focus on fishing or exploring. Every sound put me on edge. I considered hiking back to the truck, but pride kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that people hike barefoot sometimes, that maybe a hunter had come through earlier. But the thought of someone moving around me at night wouldn't leave my mind. That evening, I built the fire higher than usual, wanting the extra light. The forest beyond the glow felt darker than before, as if the trees were closing in tighter. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my hatchet beside me, within reach. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound of breathing, not my own, outside, slow, steady, controlled. It was close, right outside the tent. My body went stiff. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves shifting under weight, the slight whistle of air moving in and out of lungs. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for what felt like hours. I could picture a shadow leaning over, watching the shape of me through the nylon. The thought made my chest tighten until I thought I'd pass out. And then, just as quietly as it came, it moved away. I listened to the footsteps fading into the woods, each one deliberate and slow, until there was only silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright, hatchet in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first light finally broke through the trees, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I tore down the tent and stuffed it into my pack. I didn't eat. I didn't even stop for water. I just threw everything together and started back down the trail. The hike back felt endless. Every sound behind me made me spin around, expecting to see someone following. The forest that had seemed peaceful 2 days ago now felt hostile, pressing against me on all sides. My heart pounded until I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees. When I reached it, I tossed my gear into the bed and slammed the doors locked before even starting the engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight as I pulled away, gravel spitting under the tires. Only once I hit the main road did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I never went back to that part of the forest again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was some drifter living off the land. Maybe a hunter playing some twisted game. Or maybe just someone who liked scaring strangers. All I know is that it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was watching me out there, moving through the trees barefoot, standing outside my tent in the middle of the night. That trip was supposed to clear my head. Instead, it left me with a memory that still crawls into my chest whenever I'm alone in the woods. I was 24 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the mountains of northern Idaho in late September of 2016. The tourist season was mostly over, and I knew the campsites would be nearly empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I had just gone through a rough breakup and felt like I needed space from people, noise, and city lights. I packed my old green backpack, my tent, sleeping bag, a small camp stove, and a week's worth of food. The weather forecast looked steady, cool during the day and dropping below freezing at night, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. The drive up into the mountains was long and slow. The road wound between thick pine trees, and as I got higher, I started to lose phone signal until it finally cut out completely. The air grew colder and sharper the further I went. I reached the campground in the late afternoon. Out of the 20 or so sites, only 2 seemed taken. One was near the entrance, a couple with a camper van, and another further down with a small orange tent. I chose a spot away from both, close to the tree line where the forest pressed against the gravel clearing. I liked the feeling of being tucked against the woods, though it always gave me a slight unease too. I set up camp slowly, taking my time to get it right since I knew I'd be here for several days. I hammered the stakes into the hard dirt, rolled out my sleeping bag, and stacked some firewood I had gathered from dead branches around the site. The sun dropped behind the peaks quickly, and by the time I had my fire going, the temperature had fallen hard. I sat there for a while, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the distant rushing of a creek somewhere down the slope. The quietness was almost too much. You never realize how constant background noise is in everyday life until you sit alone in the woods. That first night was uneventful. I crawled into my sleeping bag, shivering for a bit before my body heat warmed it. I woke up several times, mostly from how silent it was, almost like my brain was searching for a sound. I thought I heard a branch snap around 3 in the morning, but it could have easily been from the trees shifting in the cold. I told myself not to think much of it. The next day, I hiked along one of the trails that looped around a nearby lake. The air smelled of wet pine needles and soil. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen logs and rocks. I saw deer prints in the mud, even some large paw tracks that looked like wolf or maybe cougar. That gave me a little pause, but I reminded myself that animals usually avoided humans if they could. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already sinking again. I cooked some beans on my small stove, ate in silence, and built another fire. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I had just turned in, zipped up in my sleeping bag, when I heard it, not far from my tent, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. Something heavy stepped on the ground. It wasn't like a deer's quick, light step. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, crunching on pine needles and dry twigs. My chest tightened immediately. I held my breath, listening as it circled slightly, the sound moving through the trees. It stopped for a while, then another crack came from a different spot, as if it had shifted its weight or taken a step closer. I told myself it was probably an elk or a bear wandering through, but something in my gut felt different. I lay completely still for what felt like hours, staring at the nylon ceiling of my tent, waiting for the sound again. Eventually, I must have drifted into a restless sleep because when I opened my eyes again, the inside of the tent was faintly lit from dawn. That morning, I checked around my campsite. The ground was scattered with pine needles, making it hard to spot tracks. But near the edge of the woods, I found something odd. There was a faint imprint in the soil, not clear enough to be a shoe print, but not shaped like a paw either. Just a vague depression. I crouched over it for a long time before stepping back. My stomach twisted, but I told myself not to overthink it. I pushed it out of my mind and went fishing down at the lake. The day passed slow. I caught nothing, and by evening I was back at camp. I built a bigger fire than usual, stacking it with extra wood, trying to chase away the edge of fear that had crept into me. The other campers had all left. I realized with a jolt that I was completely alone now. Not a single other tent or car in sight. That night was worse. I had barely lain down when the noises began again. This time, closer. I heard something dragging along the ground, like a foot scraping against dirt. Then a distinct, sharp crack of a stick snapping directly behind my tent. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I gripped the small hatchet I always kept near me for chopping wood, my hands sweating around the handle. The sound circled again, this time moving slowly, as if whatever it was walking around my campsite. I could hear breathing, not loud, but steady, human-like breathing. I froze. Every nerve in me screamed to get up, run, drive away, but I couldn't make myself unzip that tent. I stayed curled up in silence, muscles locked. It went on for hours. Sometimes it was quiet, so quiet I thought maybe it had left. Then I'd hear another step, another faint crunch. By the time light crept back into the tent, I was exhausted, barely having slept a minute. When I finally forced myself outside, I found more signs. Small twigs broken, patches of ground disturbed, and near my fire pit, a large boot print, clear as day. Someone had been there. That was the moment the fear really hit me. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been watching me, circling my tent, waiting in the dark while I lay there with nothing but thin nylon between us. My skin crawled at the thought. I packed as quickly as I could. My hands shook as I shoved everything into my bag without care. I doused the fire with the last of my water, threw my pack into the car, and started driving back down the mountain road without even looking back. On the way down, every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching me. Every turn of the road made me expect to see someone standing there. My eyes darted constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure step out from the woods behind me. By the time I hit cell service again, the relief was overwhelming. I pulled into the first gas station I found, hands still shaking on the wheel. I sat there for a long while, staring out the windshield, trying to process it. I never went back to that campground. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. The heavy steps, the breathing, the boot print by the fire pit. I'll never know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know this much. They weren't just passing through. They were watching me. They chose my campsite and they stayed close for hours in the dark. That thought has never left me. I had been camping for years, in forests, mountains, and lakesides, but I had never tried anything as reckless as pitching a tent in a graveyard. It wasn't meant to be some daring stunt or a way to prove anything to anyone. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 22 years old, restless and chasing strange experiences. I had this idea in my head that if I could spend a whole night alone in a graveyard, I'd finally break through the unease I always carried with me whenever I was alone in the dark. The place I picked was an old cemetery on the edge of a small town in upstate New York. I'd passed by it plenty of times before when I was younger, riding in the back seat of my dad's truck, watching the broken headstones flash by through the window. It had no gates, just an old stone wall running unevenly around it, half collapsed in some places. The graves were spread across a big patch of land that backed into woods. Some of the stones leaned heavily to the side. Their names faded so badly you couldn't read them. Grass grew high around them, and there were gaps where entire stones had toppled into the dirt. It was mid-August when I went. The day had been humid, and by the time I arrived around 6 in the evening, the air was sticky, the sky low with heavy gray clouds. I parked my old Honda at the side of the road where the wall crumbled enough for me to step through. With my pack on my shoulders, I climbed over into the grass and felt the place swallow me. It was silent in a way that made me notice every sound I made, from the creak of my boots in the damp grass to the rattle of the tent poles clanging together in my bag. I picked a spot in the far corner, near the woods where the ground was fairly level. The grass there was tangled and higher than the rest, but I cleared enough to flatten my small tent. I set it up quickly, trying not to think too much about the crooked stones standing all around me. Some were so close, just a few feet from where I planned to sleep, that I could have leaned out and touched them. My stomach felt tight as I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, but I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. By the time the tent was up, the sky had grown darker than I expected. The clouds had thickened, turning the whole cemetery into this dull, flat gray. The air smelled like damp earth, heavy and wet, and I realized it was going to rain. I sat outside on my little camp chair, chewing on a sandwich, watching the tree line sway in the distance. The longer I sat, the more I noticed how strangely uneven the ground was. Little mounds and dips that I hadn't paid attention to before. Some of the older stones had sunk halfway into the soil, crooked like teeth in a broken jaw. When the rain finally started, it came quick. Big, heavy drops splattered the tent, darkening the grass around me. I shoved my things inside and sat hunched up with the zipper pulled closed, listening to the steady patter. The smell of wet grass filled the tent. For a while I just sat there, scrolling through my phone, killing time, but the signal was bad, and eventually the battery started to die. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the dark with only my small lantern lit, the sound of the rain easing off outside. It was then I first noticed it, a sound that didn't fit. At first I thought it was just leftover raindrops dripping from the trees, but then it grew steady, deliberate. Footsteps, slow, heavy steps through the wet grass, not far from where I sat. My heart jumped hard into my throat. I turned the lantern off instantly, crouched low, listening. The steps grew closer, dragging a little uneven like whoever it was moving carefully. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tight. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I could hear the wet grass shift, like weight pressing down. My hand fumbled for the zipper, but I didn't dare make a sound. The air inside the tent felt hot and suffocating. My mind scrambled with possibilities. Someone had followed me in, maybe a drunk, maybe a homeless man. Whoever it was just stood there, breathing, or at least I thought I could hear faint breathing under the patter of water still dripping from the trees. After what felt like a full minute, the sound moved again. The steps dragged off, slow, toward the deeper part of the cemetery. I didn't move. I stayed hunched, every nerve in my body firing, waiting for them to come back. Eventually, after maybe 15 minutes of silence, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer, even. The sound of feet can play tricks in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the way it had stopped right outside my tent. I didn't sleep. I just lay on my back, staring at the dim outline of the fabric above me, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Around midnight, the rain started again, lighter this time. I was half drifting when something jolted me back awake. a thud against the side of my tent. Not hard, but sharp enough to make the fabric ripple. I sat up instantly, blood pounding in my ears. The thud came again, lower down this time, as if someone had pressed a boot or a hand against the wall. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The lantern glow cast only a faint circle on the ground. The cemetery stretched out in wet, shadowy silence. The stones gleamed slick in the dim light, but there was no one there. No movement, no shape. My breath shook as I zipped it shut again. The rest of the night passed in a kind of blur. I kept hearing things. Snaps of twigs, shifts in the grass, faint dragging sounds near the woods. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, whether it was footsteps or just my mind winding itself tighter and tighter. Every noise made my skin crawl. My flashlight shook in my hands whenever I lifted it. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the stones, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep a minute. By the time dawn came, the sky lightening to a pale gray and the birds starting up in the trees, I was already stuffing my sleeping bag and tearing the tent down. My hands shook the whole time, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at the woods and the crooked stones. I didn't care about folding anything neatly. I shoved it all into the pack, slung it over my shoulders, and bolted back toward the wall. When I got to my car, I saw something that made me freeze. The ground around my car was soaked and muddy from the rain. Across that mud were tracks, shoe prints, deep and heavy, circling my car. They weren't mine. I could see the tread clearly, larger than my boots, stamped into the mud as if someone had walked around my car in the night while I was trapped inside the graveyard. I didn't stop to think. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until the cemetery was far behind me. Even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in the wet grass, that slow dragging sound moving closer. I can still see those shoe prints circling my car, proof that I hadn't imagined it. Someone else had been there that night, moving through the cemetery in the rain, watching me while I hid inside my tent. That was the first and last time I ever camped in a graveyard. I was 26 in the summer of 2015 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the northern part of Michigan. I'd been working long hours at my job, sitting behind a desk, and I felt like I was rotting inside. I needed to breathe, to get away from traffic and ringing phones and endless emails. So I packed up my old tent, a cheap sleeping bag, some food, and a small cooler, and I drove my beat-up Ford Escape out toward the woods near Huron National Forest. It wasn't a campground with other people or any sort of ranger around. I wanted real quiet, so I went for a dispersed camping area where you just find a patch of land off the trail and set up. The trailhead was empty when I parked. No other cars. The afternoon sun was heavy, bugs buzzing in the humid air. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started walking deeper into the trees. The forest felt thick, like it wanted to swallow sound. I could hear every step I took, twigs snapping, my boots crunching leaves that had already dried out from lack of rain. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but also something metallic that I couldn't quite place. After about 40 minutes of walking, I found a flat clearing near a fallen log where I decided to make camp. I pitched my tent, sweating and swatting at mosquitoes. I gathered some wood, built a small fire ring out of stones, and lit it once the sun began to sink. The flames felt good even though it was warm. Fire always makes me feel less alone, like it's the only living thing with me. I sat there, cooking a hot dog on a stick, drinking a cheap beer from the cooler, just listening to the cicadas buzzing loud in the trees. As dusk turned to night, the forest shifted. The daytime noises went quiet, and everything became sharper, darker. I could hear movement every so often, twigs snapping, something rustling through the undergrowth. First, I thought it was just deer. Michigan is full of them. But one sound made me freeze. It was a heavy step, slower, not like a deer bounding or a raccoon scurrying. It was weight, like a person moving in the brush. I turned off my headlamp and just sat still, listening. My fire had died down to glowing coals, so I was almost in complete darkness. The sound didn't come closer, but it didn't fade either. I told myself it was nothing, probably my nerves making me hear more than there was. After a while, I zipped into my tent, crawled into my bag, and lay there staring at the nylon roof. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I started to drift, I'd jolt awake because I thought I heard something outside. The faint crunch of leaves, the pop of a branch. Once, I swore I heard breathing, slow and heavy. I held my own breath, heart hammering, waiting. Nothing, just silence. My throat felt dry, but I didn't want to move to grab my water bottle. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke up in the middle of the night. My phone said 3:17 a.m. The tent felt hotter than it should have. I noticed something strange immediately. The zipper of my tent door was down about 5 inches. I never leave it open because of bugs. My stomach dropped. I lay frozen, staring at that small gap. I couldn't see anything beyond it, just blackness. I listened so hard my ears rang, but I didn't hear a thing outside. My mind ran wild. Did I forget to zip it all the way, or had someone opened it? I thought about the sound of steps earlier, the weight of them. My hands shook as I reached slowly for the hatchet I always kept in the corner of the tent. The handle felt slick in my sweaty grip. I couldn't stay inside. Every second, I pictured someone crouched right outside, waiting. I counted to 3 in my head, yanked the zipper the rest of the way down, and burst out with the hatchet raised. My light flicked on, cutting through the trees. Nothing, just trees, brush, the faint shimmer of dew on the grass. The fire had gone completely out. Still, I felt watched. My skin crawled like 1,000 eyes were on me. I walked a wide circle around my campsite, light swinging, heart racing. I saw nothing unusual, no tracks in the dirt, no movement. But when I came back to the tent, my cooler was open. The lid wasn't sealed like I left it. 2 beers and a pack of jerky were gone. My mouth went dry again. I knew then it wasn't an animal. Animals don't unzip tents. Animals don't take sealed food and leave everything else. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my back against the log, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for the sky to turn gray. Every noise made me twitch. At one point, I thought I saw movement down by the thicker trees. A shadow shifting, something tall. But when I shined my light, it vanished. Morning finally came slow, the air cold with fog hanging low. I packed my things in silence, eyes scanning the tree line every second. I stuffed the tent down without folding it, tossed everything haphazard into my pack, and started back down the trail. My legs felt weak, my shoulders heavy. Halfway to the car, I noticed boot prints on the trail. Not mine. They were fresher, pressed deep into the dirt, pointing in the same direction I was walking. Whoever it was had been ahead of me, close, too close. When I got back to the parking lot, my stomach dropped again. My car door was closed, but the handle had dirt smudges that weren't there before. I unlocked it, climbed in fast, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard. The inside smelled normal, nothing missing, but the thought of someone trying the handle while I was gone made me sick. I drove until I hit the main road, and even then I didn't stop. I didn't eat, didn't drink water, just drove. Every car that appeared behind me made me check my mirrors 100 times. By the time I got home, I felt wrung out, like my nerves had been scraped raw. I dumped my gear in the garage and checked every door and window in my house twice before I sat down. That night, I didn't sleep much either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that half-open tent zipper and the boot prints pressed in the trail. I never reported it. What would I even say? Some stranger unzipped my tent, stole my food, maybe followed me back toward my car? No one would care. It wasn't illegal to be in those woods. But I know what I felt out there. The way the forest pressed in on me. The way every instinct screamed that I was being hunted. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I was 28 years old the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through Austria. It was July of 2015, and I had been traveling across Europe for a couple of weeks, but I was starting to feel restless in cities. Vienna, Salzburg, Innsbruck. All of them had been beautiful, but the noise, the crowds, the constant rush of people and trams left me craving quiet. I rented a small car and drove out into the countryside, heading toward the Tyrolean Alps. I had no real plan other than to find a remote campsite where I could spend a night or two surrounded by mountains and fresh air. The drive itself felt almost unreal. Green valleys opened wide on either side of the road, with steep gray peaks in the distance capped in snow even in the heat of July. Small wooden houses with flower boxes on every window dotted the hillsides. I stopped in a little town for supplies: bread, cheese, bottled water, a pack of sliced ham, and then carried on until I found a trailhead leading into a wooded valley with a sign pointing toward a small camping area. I pulled over, strapped on my pack, and started walking. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching on gravel echoing around me. The trees were tall, dense spruce, their shadows cooling the air. I didn't see anyone else. It felt like the place had been forgotten by time. Eventually, I reached a clearing by a narrow river. There was a patch of flattened grass where others had clearly camped before, and a crude stone fire ring. It looked perfect. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and boiled some water for coffee on my small stove. For the first few hours, it was peaceful. I wandered down to the river, rinsed my face in the freezing water, and sat on the bank watching it rush over smooth rocks. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden slants, and for a while I thought I had made the right choice leaving the cities. But then something shifted. Around 7 in the evening, as the shadows grew longer, I noticed movement up the trail. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone setting up their own camp nearby. But as the figure drew closer, I felt a tightness in my stomach. He wasn't carrying gear, no backpack, no sleeping bag, nothing that suggested camping. Just a man, maybe in his 40s, thin and tall, with messy hair that looked greasy even in the fading light. He wore a dark jacket zipped up to his throat, even though the air was still warm, and his jeans were mud-stained. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood there, just looking. I avoided eye contact and pretended to busy myself with my stove. I figured if I ignored him, he would just keep walking. But he didn't. He stayed there for maybe a minute, not moving, not speaking, just watching. My skin prickled. Finally, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared up the trail. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself he was just a strange local passing through. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I cooked some food, ate quickly, and doused the fire before retreating to my tent. I zipped it up tight and lay down, listening. The forest was loud in its own way, rushing water, the occasional crack of a branch, the calls of distant birds. But every time one of those natural sounds stopped, I caught myself straining to hear something else. Footsteps, breathing, anything unnatural. At one point, maybe around midnight, I swore I heard the sound of twigs snapping nearby. I froze, my heart hammering. After several minutes of silence, I told myself it was probably just a deer moving through the underbrush. Eventually, I fell into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke, it was still dark. My watch said 3:20 a.m. I didn't know what had stirred me at first, but then I realized the faint crunch of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate circling. My throat tightened. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would just pass by. The footsteps stopped right near my tent. I could see a faint shadow cast against the thin fabric, long, unmoving, just standing there. I felt trapped. The nylon wall, the only thing between me and whoever was outside. Minutes crawled by. My body ached from staying so rigid, every muscle tense. Finally, the shadow shifted. The steps retreated into the woods, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep again that night. At the first light of dawn, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my stove into the dirt. I stuffed the tent into my bag half collapsed, not even bothering to fold it properly. I just needed to get out. As I started down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest looked the same as the day before, but it felt different now, heavy, like it was pressing in on me. Halfway back to where I had parked, I saw him again. He was standing at a bend in the trail, maybe 30 yards ahead, facing me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. My stomach flipped. I couldn't turn back. There was no other path out. I gripped the straps of my pack and forced myself forward, heart racing so hard I could barely hear over it. As I approached, he stepped off the trail into the trees, vanishing without a sound. When I reached the spot where he had stood, I looked into the forest but saw nothing but endless trunks and shadows. I didn't linger. I practically jogged the rest of the way to my car, threw my pack inside, and slammed the doors. I drove for hours without stopping, not caring about the winding roads or the sharp cliffs dropping away beside me. I just needed distance. When I finally reached a larger town, I pulled into a crowded gas station and sat in the car, hands trembling on the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I looked in every mirror, half expecting to see him walking across the parking lot, but he wasn't there. I never went back to that campsite. In fact, I never camped alone again after that trip. The woods, once a place of peace and escape, now felt like a place where someone could watch, follow, and wait. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was harmless, maybe just a wanderer. But the way he appeared, the way he stood outside my tent in the middle of the night, it didn't feel harmless. The memory still clings to me years later, sharper than any of the beautiful sights I saw on that trip. People think the wilderness is dangerous because of bears or storms or accidents. But the truth is, it's the people you don't expect to find out there. The ones with no gear, no purpose, no reason to be so deep in the woods, that make it terrifying. And I will never forget the sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent in the Austrian dark. I was 26 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep into the forests of Montana. It was early October of 2011, and the air had that sharp edge that comes right before winter sets in. The days were cool, the nights colder, and the leaves were a patchwork of reds, oranges, and golds. I had been planning the trip for weeks, checking my gear, sighting my rifle, packing only what I thought I'd need for 3 nights out there. I wanted the quiet, the solitude, and hopefully some venison to stock my freezer. I drove my old truck up a series of narrow dirt roads until the forest seemed to swallow everything around me. By the time I parked at the end of a logging trail, there were no other vehicles in sight. Just trees, hills, and silence. I liked it that way. I slung my pack and rifle over my shoulder and started hiking in. The ground was covered with fallen leaves that crunched under my boots, and every now and then a gust of wind would send a scatter of them tumbling across the trail. I walked about 2 miles in before setting up camp in a small clearing not far from a stream. The clearing was just big enough for my small green tent and a fire pit made from some loose stones. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and set to work pitching camp. By late afternoon, I had the tent up, a fire ready to be lit, and my gear sorted. I filled my canteen at the stream, filtered the water, and sat there for a while listening to it rush over rocks. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal of beans and jerky over the fire, then climbed into my sleeping bag as the temperature dropped into the 30s. The sound of the forest at night is never truly silent. There's always the occasional rustle, the snap of a twig, an owl somewhere far off. But I'd camped enough to know the difference between normal sounds and something that wasn't right. That night, everything felt normal. I drifted off quickly. The next day, I woke early, breath fogging inside the tent, and set out before sunrise. I tracked along game trails, rifle in hand, moving slow and deliberate. Hours passed with nothing but squirrels darting through the underbrush and the distant drumming of a woodpecker. Around midday, I spotted fresh deer tracks in some soft soil near a low ridge. My pulse picked up. I followed them carefully, staying downwind, listening for any sign of movement. I never did see the deer. Instead, I stumbled on something else, a campsite, or what was left of one. It was maybe half a mile off the ridge, tucked in behind a thicket. At first glance, it just looked abandoned, but the closer I got, the stranger it felt. There was a torn blue tarp tangled in the brush, a small fire pit with cold ashes, and some gear scattered around as if it had been dropped in a hurry. A pair of boots lay on their sides, not lined up, not packed away. I crouched and picked one up. It was damp, the leather stiff. Whoever left them hadn't been back for days, maybe weeks. The weirdest part was the tent. It was half collapsed. One pole snapped, the fabric sagging into itself. The zipper was torn wide open, like someone had ripped it from the inside. I stood there staring, waiting for my mind to settle on some simple explanation. Maybe a bear tore through it. Maybe someone got spooked, abandoned their stuff, and never came back. But if that was the case, why hadn't they taken their boots? Or their pack, which I found lying nearby with most of the straps cut? I didn't like it. The whole place gave me a crawling feeling in my gut, like I was being watched. I backed away slowly, rifle tight in my grip, eyes sweeping the treeline. I made my way back to my own camp, my pace faster than before, and tried to shake it off. That night, I sat by my fire longer than usual. I kept glancing into the darkness, listening for anything unusual. The forest seemed too quiet. Even when the fire crackled, I thought I heard faint noises behind it, past the glow, like faint footsteps or brush moving. Every time I looked, there was nothing there but shadows. I finally put the fire out and climbed into the tent, but sleep didn't come easy. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I didn't know why at first, then I heard it. A single, slow crunch of leaves just outside my tent. Then silence. My mouth went dry. I reached for the rifle lying next to me and kept still, straining my ears. After what felt like forever, there was another crunch, this time to the left, closer. Someone or something was moving around my camp. I waited, gripping the rifle so tight my hands hurt. The footsteps circled slowly, pausing now and then, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. My tent wall rippled faintly, as if brushed by a hand or shoulder. I froze, every muscle locked. Then, after another stretch of silence, the sounds moved off into the woods. Eventually, I heard nothing at all. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as it was light, I packed my gear fast and hard, shoving everything into my bag with shaky hands. My plan had been to stay 3 nights, but my gut told me that was a mistake. Something wasn't right out there. On the hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone trailing me just out of sight. Once I thought I did. A flicker of movement in the trees, a dark figure between the trunks. But when I stopped and aimed my rifle, there was nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. When I finally reached my truck, relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I tossed my gear in the bed, climbed in, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For the briefest second, I thought I saw a man standing at the edge of the road, half hidden by the trees. But when I blinked, he was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. Later, I couldn't get the abandoned campsite out of my mind. I looked online, checked old reports, even asked around at a gas station. I learned that about a year earlier, a hunter had gone missing in those woods. His truck was found near where I'd parked. Search parties went out but never found him. I don't know if that collapsed tent belonged to him. I don't know who was walking around my camp that night. But I know one thing: I've never gone hunting alone again.